Thank you. My name is Herb and I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to our Big Book Telephone 12-Step Workshop. Please join me in prayer for an open mind and an open heart. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path in you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. We've been warming up to the work of the steps, and this is in some ways the final session on the warm-up as an orientation. Now, there's been a lot of substance in the warm-up and the orientation. We've looked at step 12, the spiritual awakening, because that's the mission, that's the purpose, that's why we're all here. That's what we want to experience. A change in the way we think and feel and behave, and it's done to us, not by us. And I added recently, but not without us. And then we took a deep look at step 11 so that we can approach the steps through the lens of power, knowing basically what to do with prayer, what to do with meditation, and if you're so inclined to incorporate some contemplation in the process. And then we took a look at step 10. As you can see, we worked our way back from the end, reviewing the tools in the kit, the toolbox that Bill calls our way of life. He says we have a daily reprieve in step 10. We've entered the world of the spirit. We have a daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of our spiritual life. That word gets misinterpreted into the explanation of 10, 11, and 12. It's not, these are not maintenance steps. They are really the improving and expanding and enlarging steps, because the dimmer switch is either going up or the dimmer switch is going down. Bill Wilson says we don't need any rules or regulations. We have only two disciplines in the 12-step culture. There's only two disciplines. One is God and one is alcohol. You're either going for one or you're going for the other. It's an amazing statement. And that's why he says in that step 10 discussion, it's not productive or healthy for us to rest on our laurels, on our past accomplishments. My mental image is that we stay gently pressed into, with our shoulder against the dimmer switch, pressed gently into it, moving that dimmer switch up a notch at a time. No violence, no particularly aggressive behavior. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about gently leaning into the Spirit and trusting that the Spirit will lean into us and draw us forward. And I would like to take a look now at the Big Book itself. Given you an assignment to take a look at the pages in the Roman numerals, and suggested that while you're reading and highlighting those pages that you ask yourself those four questions. Why do I want to do this work? Why now? In what areas am I being dishonest? And am I willing to go to any length? And what does that mean? And this is the final week for you to discern those questions and to answer those questions if you haven't answered them in a sentence or in a paragraph or in a page per question. And that's really up to you. And it's not for me and it's not for the group, it's for yourself. Most of the questions that I will challenge you with are questions that I'm asking you to ask yourself with a sense of open-mindedness and open-heartedness, with that set-aside attitude in prayer, and using radical honesty. Bill uses rigorous, which is demanding enough. I like the word radical. It's not in the big book, but it's root, or in radix in Latin, meaning at the root. At the root. Honest to the marrow of my bones, to the best of my ability. Again, no violence here, just being a commitment to being open with myself to the extent that I will reveal to myself what I'm thinking and feeling, and especially what I'm doing. That very first title page in the big book has only 2 words, Alcoholics Anonymous. But I had suggested that you look up the word anonymous. It comes from the Greek word onoma, onoma, O-N-O-M-A, which means name. And when you put an A-N in front of it, it just is a negative. It means no name. This was the original spirit, which was then pretty much institutionalized in the traditions, especially traditions 11 and 12, which is a spiritual approach to humility. One of many, not being special, not being no leadership, no saints, just grains of sand on a beach. Each of us uniquely different as an individual, but not uniquely different as a group. We're addicts on the one hand, and we're human beings on the other hand. And step 1 treats both aspects of that. We'll come to that at the beginning of next week. The assignment for next week will be to begin with assignment 3 on the body, the doctor's opinion. I have had you read up to the doctor's opinion. If you have read further, that's fine. But now I want you to read the doctor's opinion and assignment number 3. The next page has some more words on it. The story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. Notice the word recovered. Past tense. I don't want to create any controversy, but my interpretation of that is that it connects us to step 10, where Bill says we're placed in a position of neutrality. Placed in a position of neutrality. That the addiction is no longer the problem. That we've been given freedom from the addiction. That's the whole point of working these steps and having a spiritual awakening, is that we receive power, and through that power we receive the gift of abstinence, but not until we finish the 9th step, and only conditional on the basis that we continue steps 10, 11, and 12 on a daily basis. You've heard me talk about that in prior sessions. Recovered, from my standpoint, refers to the first half of the first step. Admitted we were powerless over alcohol, dash. Admitted we were powerless over our addiction, dash. Placed in a position of neutrality with regard to our addiction. I believe that's what recovered means, because Bill says in that step 10 material on pages 84 and 85 that we're not cured. Well, what does he mean by that? He doesn't tell us. But reading the big book and understanding its instruction and having the experience that I have, it's my interpretation that that means that the spiritual malady is ever present. The selfishness, self-centeredness that Bill describes on page 62, which we will look at when we look at unmanageability, the spiritual malady, that's the human condition. And it never goes away. We will always be selfish and self-centered. And to the extent that we stay faithful to our way of life, steps 10, 11, and 12 on a daily basis, that self-centeredness is contained, but never eliminated. We're never free of it. In fact, in step 10, Bill says, watch for resentment and fear and dishonesty and selfishness, the things that we looked at in step 4 and will look at later on as we travel this path. He says when they crop up, not if they crop up. A daily reprieve. And so there's a large blank spot there in the 4th edition that used to have the AA logo, the circle with the triangle inside, the triangle representing the 3 sides of the program. And I don't know whether this works or not, but so I wrote in my own circle and triangle with the steps at the bottom, the traditions on the left, and the concepts on the right. Literally 36 principles. In 1939, the 12 steps were codified in the big book. In 1950, the traditions were institutionalized in AA in the first international conference. And in 1955, the 12 concepts were ratified at the second international conference. And Bill says we have 36 principles. The steps are for the individual, the traditions are for the groups, and the concepts are for the people who are providing service within the organizational structure, a nonprofit spiritual organization. All brilliant. And as you get any interest at all in any of the additional principles, the traditions, and the concepts, you will see the brilliance of Bill Wilson and an amazing sense of organization and strategy with regard to making sure that the 12-step culture and organization stays around for its duration. After I had done the steps 3 different times with 3 different teachers, 3 different step guides, and looking back over my shoulder and processing my experience, I saw that that circle and the triangle really applies also to the spiritual path of the individual. The circle being a symbol for God, infinite, having no beginning, no end, and the triangle being a representative symbol of the human being. And this is critically important from my experience for you to grasp and at least make note of as we go forward, because it will help you understand the nature of step 1 and then the nature of each step and its organic integration with each step as we go forward, and the entire 12-step methodology as you experience it. The first half of the first step, and you might want to make a note and just put addiction down as a word on a piece of paper, and then put a dash and put unmanageability. That represents the 2 major words of the two major components of step one. The first half of step one to deal with the addiction, the second half of step one to deal with unmanageability. And then under addiction, put an upside down V as you're outlining it, and on the left hand slant at the bottom put body, and on the right hand slant at the bottom put mind. Those are the two things that are the components of addiction. There's only two components to addiction. All the rest is drama and story. In the body, once I start, I cannot stop. In the mind, once I stop, I cannot stay stopped. Now, we're going to unpack those at some level of depth as we go forward with the doctor's opinion next week. But this gives you a roadmap that will give you the context. And then underneath unmanageability, draw a straight line down and put will. I believe that's the core of the spiritual malady. We have free will, but in some areas it's not free. And we'll explore that as we explore step one, the final component of powerlessness and no choice. In our body, we're powerless, and Dr. Silkworth will explain his opinion about having an allergy that produces a phenomenon of craving. In our mind, Bill picks up the baton at that point and explains about the mental obsession and the delusion. We don't know that we don't know, and we can't see that we don't see, and we don't learn from our experiences. The first half of the first step is relevant to addicts, only a percentage of the human race. The second half of the first step, relevant for all human beings. 100% of human beings have a problem of unmanageability, the spiritual malady, self-will run riot. And Bill says addicts are extreme example of self-will run riot. The two things that make us specifically human are our mind and our will. No other sentient being has a mind like ours that is self-reflective. We can stand above ourselves, outside of ourselves, and observe ourselves and reflect on our reflection. We can know, and we can know that we know. And we also have free will. We can make a completely voluntary decision to be on this call or not on this call, and even on the call to pay attention or not pay attention. We have complete free will. Society and civilization forever has been built on the basis of personal responsibility, free will. That in fact we have the ability to make decisions and take actions and that have consequences, and we are responsible for those consequences. Now there's lots of variations on that theme, but that's the essence of it. And Bill is proposing here that there are some areas that we're in fact have no power of choice. It comes under the large umbrella of powerlessness in step one. Roman numeral 11 has in the second paragraph a term, the basic text. For me, that signals that that's the nature of this book. It's not a book of history. It's not an autobiography of Bill. It's a textbook, like an auto mechanic's manual. Now, my experience is it's not intuitive. Some people may be able to read it and grasp the instructions and see specific instructions. I was not. And I was in book studies and step studies for 4 years, going to a meeting every day, calling a sponsor every day, and I was not able to discern that this was a textbook and it had specific instructions. I needed a step guide to shine the light of his experience on this book, and that allowed those sentences to crack open and for the meaning then to become visible to me based on the instructions I got from a man who had the knowledge as well as the experience of unpacking the big book and the specific step process. This is a textbook. And that's why we read it and highlight it. That's why we reread it and highlight it with different colors, as you'll see as we go forward. Dr. Silkworth was a psychiatrist, I think, certainly a medical doctor that ran Towns Hospital, the alcoholic treatment center, alcoholic and drug treatment center actually in New York that Bill went to 4 different times. Bill went there in 1933 once, and when he got out, he began drinking again. He went into that Towns Hospital 3 different times in 1934, September, November, and December. And in the final December, he was sufficiently grounded in the Oxford group, and that he worked the steps on his second day of hospitalization. And on the 3rd day, he had a spiritual awakening on the 3rd day. I think it's December 11th. He went into the hospital. He worked the steps on December 12th. And on December 13th, he had his spiritual awakening. And you could take a look at those if you were interested in Bill's story to confirm his process. It's pretty superficial by our standards anyway. Ebby took him through the steps. They were 6 steps of the Oxford group on page 13. And then on page 14, Bill describes his powerful mountaintop spiritual experience the following day. It says on page Roman numeral 12, all the changes made in the big book were made so that people could identify with the current version of experience of alcoholism. So progressively bringing in women, progressively bringing in young people, progressively bringing in different levels of demographics, so that as the big book and the 12-step culture expands across the world, more people can identify with the problem and with the solution. In fact, at the bottom of that page, it says, the identification. Yes, that happened to me. Yes, I felt like that. Yes, this program will work for me too. The whole formula for identification. Forward to the first edition. The very first paragraph is pretty much the key for this foreword. We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women. This is the first edition. The foreword to the first edition, 1939. And he says there's 100 men and women. Well, there weren't 100, and there was no women that had 6 months of recovery, which they figured was long-term sobriety in 1939. In the second printing, there was a couple women. One of the names was Marty Mann, M-A-N-N, and she later on founded the National Council of Alcoholism. She was a very passionate worker on behalf of recovery. Who have recovered, there's that past tense word again in the first paragraph, from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Notice I'm reinforcing my interpretation of the first half of the first step to deal with addiction, mind and body. To show other alcoholics, now look at the squiggly lines, as Joe and Charlie called it, italics. Precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. It's a textbook. Precisely. Once again, I could not read and understand and do what this big book suggested without somebody's supervision and teaching. I absolutely needed a teacher, a mentor, a step guide. My sponsor was never equipped to do this, and I had to go outside of that. I kept him as my sponsor, uncommon common sense and a great sounding board for living life. But I needed specific technical help to do the work of this, of these steps out of this textbook. And then one of my favorite lines, and in fact, the workshops that I do are based on this line at the bottom of the very first paragraph in the first printing of the foreword to the very first printing. And besides, we are sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. All, not just all addicts, all human beings. And you'll see that as we approach unmanageability, the spiritual malady, which I call the human condition. He makes a comment there again about anonymity. There are pamphlets on anonymity. If you have an interest to pursue those, I would recommend that you get one of those pamphlets. Maybe it's even on the website of AA. I've never actually looked at that. On page 14, Roman numeral 14, it says, "We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted." And as I became more familiar with the Big Book, in my meditation, the wee small voice suggested that I drop the word service in the 12th step, which is, I had used it for a decade anyway. And it said, use the word help, Herb. It's got earth in it. It's got dirt in it. You will sweat. You will be frustrated. You will be exercised in working with other people. Service is a little too sophisticated for you, Herb. Use the term help. And I'm recently changing some of my slide presentations. I was in Michigan this weekend, and my slides still have the word service in it. And one of the people who I was talking like this to made the suggestion that I update my slides. It's a wonderful idea, so that I simplify my level of communication. We should like to be helpful in such cases. The foreword to the second edition is probably my favorite of all of the forewords, because it has a lot of wonderful history outlined, not necessarily fully explained. I'm a dilettante historian at the same time, so I've done a lot of reading of the AA-produced books like Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, etc., and AA Comes of Age. And so I can fill in some of the blanks or understand some of the references here. At the bottom of Roman numeral 15, it says, Bill gets quite poetic. The spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck at Akron, Ohio in June of 1935. Well, that's when Bill was in Akron, met Dr. Bob, a great story. And Dr. Bob was already in the Oxford group. Bill had only 6 months of sobriety. He'd been around the Oxford group for a couple of months, but finally had worked the steps in his third hospitalization, as I mentioned, and had his mountaintop mystical experience. And he goes to Akron to do a business deal, which eventually failed. And he reached out to get help, and somebody referred him to Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob was already in the Oxford group for 2.5 years, but he didn't know what the problem was. He knew what the solution was: prayer and meditation and helping others in inventory and making amends. He knew all of that from the Oxford group 6 steps, but he wasn't able to do it. He wasn't able to certainly do the full inventory, revealing all his secrets, nor was he able to do all of the amends, acknowledging his alcoholism to his community, because he was afraid he would lose his medical license. And then Bill shows up and explains to him, the doctor, which is just ironic as hell, that you have a physical allergy and a mental obsession. It has nothing to do with morals. It has nothing to do with willpower. It has nothing to do with knowledge. It has everything to do with embracing that you're powerless. There's no hope. There's no hope outside of establishing a relationship with power. And Bob finally did get it after one relapse, went out and made the amends and stayed sober for the balance of his life from that moment, 1935 to 1950, when he died. But the point I'm making is, Dr. Bob's a very intelligent guy. He's a surgeon. He's on the staff of that town's hospital. And he's a wonderful Christian man. And he's in the Oxford group, going to meetings every week. But after going to the meeting every week for 2.5 years, each week he got drunk. He didn't know what the problem was, so he couldn't apply the solution. Once he identified what the problem was, he could apply the solution and wanted to. Making amends was his turning point. 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience, like I've talked about, in the hospital, following a meeting with an alcoholic friend. That's Ebby Thatcher, who was in contact with the Oxford group. That's a group that was trying to recreate first century Christianity. They had nothing to do with alcoholics. They didn't want to actually deal with them. But because a lot of the members had come who were in spheres of influence in various cities, and they were alcoholic, they tolerated them. Like Roland Hazard was the first one who was sent by Carl Jung to find a spiritual experience. He found the Oxford group, got sober, reached out to Ebby Thatcher. Ebby Thatcher found the Oxford group, got sober. The sixth step of the Oxford group says, once you get it, you've got to share it with somebody else if you want to keep it. We've heard that before. And he reached out to Bill Wilson, and Bill Wilson reached out to Dr. Bob, and it's all rooted in the Oxford group, this first century Christianity group that had 6 steps. I believe they're on page 263 in the 4th edition, if you want to take a look at those 6 steps of the Oxford group. And it confirms at the bottom of page 16 that Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness were explained to Dr. Bob. The physician then began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never been able before to muster. And he confirms here the ever-present theme of the 12 steps. And that's the turning from self-centeredness to other-centeredness. It seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another alcoholic as no non-alcoholic could. It also, I'm on page Roman numeral 17. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital, life-giving. That's the origin of vital, vitae in Latin. To permanent recovery. Permanent recovery. That's why Bill uses the term recovered. Recovered with regard to the addiction, not cured with regard to the spiritual malady. I'm going to continue to emphasize that distinction throughout the first step so that we really kind of see what Bill, that we really see at depth what Bill is really talking about here in the big book. I'm very passionate about this distinction because I do believe that the understanding of unmanageability and the term not cured and the way of life concept are the best kept secrets in the rooms of the 12th step. And it could be a significant reason for, number one, the sad percentage of relapse. And number two, the fact that AA isn't exploding and growing, or the 12-step fellowships aren't exploding and growing like they would if, in fact, people really had broken the code on the spiritual life and lived it. There's lots of history going forward now, especially talking about the way that AA got some visibility, as well as the development of the traditions. Interesting stuff, not that relevant to the specific step process, so I'm not going to spend any time on it. But it is interesting on page 20 that he basically says about 75% of the people who really tried got and stayed sober. No, he says it. 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses. 75% got and stayed sober in the early days. By their reckoning, it's not science. It's a wet finger in the wind estimate. But that's certainly not the estimate today. I'd be generous in saying 20% of the people stay sober beyond 5 years. 20% stay sober beyond, and I'm being generous. And that comes from some of the treatment center or the government statistics. And quite frankly, nobody really knows, because there's nobody going to spend the kind of money necessary to do that kind of valid survey. But it's an estimate, and you could ask yourself in terms of your own experience in going to meetings and dealing with people, if you've got 2 or 3 or 4 years, especially over 5 years, watching the swinging doors. Page 21, we have no monopoly on recovery. If therapy works for people, terrific. If relationships work, if religion works, if work works, if human development works, terrific, wonderful, go for it. I'm a very practical person, as is Bill Wilson in the big book. I've never found anything more effective for me personally, or the way I deliver it to other people. I've not found anything more effective than this 12-step method. And he talks about a high road to a new freedom. And I just love that poetic clarity. We have a high road to a new freedom. And that's what I tell my sponsees. Take the high road. Always identify the principle and take the high road. They complain. Do we always have to take the high road? And I go, no, absolutely not. Do we always have to operate on principle? Absolutely not. If you take the low road or don't operate on principle, there will be outcome. So you choose your outcome. I recommend the high road in principle. But there are no rules. There are only consequences to your actions. And so you have a choice. What outcomes do you want? How free do you want to be? And you'll hear me say that more than once. It's a mantra with me. How free do you want to be? I get pushback all the time from people. Do I really have to do that? Do I have to do all of that? Do I have to spend that kind of... No, absolutely not. You don't have to. You don't have to. You don't have to. And there are no shoulds. How free do you want to be? Forward to the 3rd edition. Down at the bottom, the last paragraph. At its core, it remains simple and personal. Each day, somewhere in the world, recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another, sharing experience, strength, and hope. Sharing, 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 not teaching, not mandating, not being the police. No, sharing our experience, strength, and hope. It assumes that we have some knowledge that has translated into experience, meaning our feet move in the direction that our mouth is talking about. Forward to the 4th edition. And this is the forward to this newest edition. They publish and republish the big book, never changing any of the substance in the doctor's opinion or 1 to 164. That's not been changed, with the exception of the change from spiritual experience to spiritual awakening in the 12th step, as we talked about in one of our earlier sessions. That's the only substantive change. All the rest have just reflected numbers in history. And again, on page Roman numeral 23, he confirms the basic text. More visionary than the founding members could have ever imagined. Clearly, my experience with it. The final piece of the foreword on page Roman numeral 24, AA share experience, strength, and hope. Again, reinforcing this is how we communicate what we've experienced with hope in order to stay sober ourselves and to help other alcoholics. Modem to modem or face to face, AA speak the language of the heart. That was the biggest transition for me, and you've seen me do that. I had a lot of information, this man said, but I had no transformation. I had a lot of knowledge that didn't get related to my feet or my motives. Once I did this work in 1988, I needed to get some information, but then I needed to have it translate into my behavior, which then gave me an experience organically changing me on the inside, that radical change that I talked about. Any change that or suggestions that had come from the outside to me, I was able to disregard when it became inconvenient. The changes that have come since 1988 have been internal and organic, and I've identified that it is actually part of my constitution, and all I needed to do was unpack it and surface it so that, in fact, it would service me. I've never said it that way, but that's kind of a poetic way of saying it. Language of the heart, power and simplicity. If we think about step 11, how does it end? Praying for the knowledge of God's will and the power to do it. I need knowledge and I need power. Many of us, most of us, all of us probably, at some point have known better and just haven't done better. Step 11 suggests that we're powerless, and so we pray so that we both know better and are able to do better. Not perfectly, but better, and that's certainly my experience. Thank you, everybody. We'll pick it up next week. Join me in the serenity prayer, please. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.